you, Kenneth Brown, for coming to town. It's been awesome hanging and chilling and talking and drinking and whatnot. So, anyway, yeah, you're on a tour of America right now?
We're on a road trip.
That's freaking
Yes.
awesome. Where have you been so far?
SoCal, Seattle,
Hmm.
Colorado, Utah,
Mm,
Kansas. We met an interesting character in
nice,
Kansas,
nice, nice.
and now we're going up all the way to New Hampshire and down to
Mm.
Florida, and so we're going to cover all four corners and try as much to see everything in between. But
Is this just for fun, or are you going to meet specific people for certain
it's a
reasons?
bit of both, and I guess for me, I would rather, it's like I already knew a couple people here and there.
Mm.
I wanted to meet new people. I
Yeah.
mean, we've been in some form of a lockdown, either legal or
Hmm.
psychological.
Oh God, yeah.
People, I've talked to very old friends where it's like, it's me, it's your friend. And they're like,
Hmm.
no, 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 I'm scared to be within 6 feet of you.
That's
We
crazy.
can't,
Yeah.
so I've noticed this kind of psychological breakdown, which I think is intentional on a
Mm.
number of levels.
Sure, sure.
And I'm like, what do you do? Because I'm personally affected by that
Hmm.
individually, and I
Yeah,
see it infect
yeah.
the whole of our globe.
Right,
And
right,
so
right.
I'm like, what can I do? Well, I can't solve the problem,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
but I can, throw my 2 cents. And I think that one of the greatest damages we do to ourselves is when we have some kind of negative pent up emotion and we have no way of exorcising that. We have no way
yeah. Mm,
of expressing that.
mm,
And I think what you do with art,
mm,
is very important in terms of when you have radical ideas, and we're not going to just agree about a lot of those
hmm,
things,
hmm,
but when
hmm.
you have radical ideas and they're just sort of pent up, um, that's where we see tragedies, that's where we see destruction, that's
Yeah,
where we see
yeah.
sadism of just like, I have an enemy, the enemy is the world,
Mm,
I want to hurt people,
mm,
not for any constructive reason, not really in
hmm.
a war even.
Yeah.
Even the brutality of war seems, you know, by contrast, seems heroic, I think, in
Hmm.
comparison to, it was just in Indianapolis the other day.
Yeah,
8 people shot for what reason, we don't know.
yeah,
And the
yeah.
expectation is when we find out, it's going to be just as senseless as if there was no reason at all.
Damn.
So that's the state of the world right now. And I think the
Mm,
only way to combat that is to just do things,
mm,
just go on a road trip or make artwork or, discipline yourself into something that is tangible, quantifiable, and
mm,
that you
mm,
can actually measure the results of it. Like,
mm.
is this road trip going to be a success? Is it going to be a failure? We've got steps along the way and we can judge each leg of the trip.
Mhm.
And in the end, we'll be able to value, but it's going to be something. It could be a steaming pile of crap. It could be, wow, that was the greatest thing ever, I want to
Yeah,
do it again.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
when's the second road
You're right,
trip?
right, right.
We don't know what's going to happen, but regardless, it's going to be something real, as opposed to
Hmm.
this kind of mental prison of like, I could do this, I could do that, I could do the other. And
Mm,
if you have the ability, like, whatever, everyone has the ability to do something, even if you are literally in a prison.
mm,
Like, you
mm.
can stare at the wall or you can read a book,
Yeah, or
or
meditate. Yeah,
you can meditate. You can, I mean, I was the Count of Monte Cristo,
great, great, great. Yeah.
so I think I really like a lot of prison literature. There's a
Mm.
Christian one called He Leadeth Me, about a Catholic priest in the
Oh,
Gulag system.
wow.
I mean, there's a lot of literature about, Robinson Crusoe. You're on an island, right? So
Hmm,
it's
hmm.
like,
What do you do?
when man has been entrapped, what does he do,
Mm,
right? Because if we don't do anything,
hmm,
we basically just consume ourselves. That's what
mm,
happens to animals in captivity. They consume themselves, they hurt
mm,
themselves,
mm,
they
mm,
stop
mm.
breeding.
Yeah.
So we have to, urbanization is a process of self-domestication, it's a process of captivity, it's a process of imprisonment. How do we as individuals and as like-minded or disagreeing individuals,
Hmm,
how do we
hmm.
deal with that and
Yeah.
try to survive, not just physically, because
Mm.
we've got food, we've got shelter,
Yeah.
but psychologically and spiritually, how do we create a plan for survival?
Mm.
How do we claw, or what do we do that's
Yeah.
that helps us deal or cope or even go beyond that into a point of thriving?
Yeah.
Where if this is all psychological imprisonment, not physical, but if it's psychological, then we're actually having to participate in that, and to some extent it's a choice. Like Kanye West had that quote about slavery was a choice, and everyone jumped on him as being like some kind of self-hating black person. But there was a deeper philosophical truth there, that so much of the mechanisms of social control are semi-consensual. Like, you're addicted to pornography, but no one's forcing you to watch it.
Right.
So there's an element of consent. That's what our whole concept of sexuality is based around now.
Okay.
It's not about the marriage of two families. It's not about the economic marriage. It's it's about
even romance, honestly.
Right. There's about this legalistic concept of consent, and that is a lot of what capitalism is based on. It's the idea of two consenting parties exchanging some kind of material wealth.
Services or goods.
Right, and everything is fungible. So like you have a plot of land, that's not hereditary, that's not something that is inherent to you or your family or your lineage. That's just a product, and you can buy it and you can sell it. And that has not really been the way people have thought about land for most of history. And that was a very radical idea, and the consequences of that, everything is a product that can be liquefied into a quantity of money, basically means that everything is just a number. There's no quality left if everything is just quantity. And that destroys our perception of the sacred and of things which are inalienable and things which are worth dying over, right? So if life is just about increasing quantities of money and property and everything's fungible, then there's nothing that is more than the quality of life itself. Like there's nothing that's beyond our individuality. And that's a great way to enslave people, right? Because if you can hold this sword over them that says, what matters is your physical breathing and your heart pumping and your lungs and everything, that's what matters, and there's an infinite value on that, and everything else is just a piece of money, then you can basically get them to do anything through that fear.
Right.
But if you convince people, hey, maybe there's something worth more than your individual life, or maybe like there's a life after this one, so you don't have to be so attached to it, that's when people start becoming willing to make sacrifices, and they're not as easily controlled, or the system of control has to be more oriented toward that afterlife or something larger.
What would, difficult to frame this question, what would be the opposite of that? Is it more tribalism or populism? What's it sounds to me what you're talking about is the atomization of people more and more in a kind of a capitalist society. So developing more community, but yet, where are you on that spectrum?
So there's an idea of elitism versus populism, and I think that's a false paradigm. I think that history and power is always concentrated in minorities. As soon as you get a social structure that is above the level of we're a family, we're a clan, we're a tribe, Dunbar's number, as soon as you get above that, everything has to be organized by people who are really, really good at organizing other people. That's when I say self-domestication, there has to be someone who's directing this process of domestication. And whoever's doing that is the one who has power, and everybody else, those are the masses. And you have hierarchies where you can kind of be in the middle class or middle management, but you have to ask, who are the people at the top, and what are their incentives? What do they want? And capitalism says that everybody wants money, that's the only value. That is actually a lie, right? That is actually a specific value which is inherent to the merchant class.
Right.
That's a certain psychological profile. As human beings, we are not like monocausal, like we don't have singular motivations most of the time. We're not monomaniacal. And so we can sympathize with the merchant class, the other two being the priest and the warrior class, but the progress of capitalism has been this domination of the merchant class over the other two classes. So what would those other two classes look like? Well, in a word, the priest class would have a theocracy, the warrior class would have what we would call in modern parlance a military dictatorship. And so those produce different incentive structures and different economic systems. Prior to capitalism, you had a system in Europe of feudalism, and feudalism is where these lords rule everything. Well, why do they get to rule? It wasn't via democracy. It's not because they have, the best ability to sell you loans or something like that. They're there because their ancestors were part of these warrior elites, eventually going back to Charlemagne. Why is Charlemagne the king? Well, he's the king because he's the chieftain. Why is he the chieftain? Well, he's the leader. How does that man become a leader in a warrior hierarchy? Through the warrior values of the ability to direct and organize men in warfare. And that's essentially, it's a problem of charisma, personality, sociality, and engineering. To have that warrior mindset of you're able to command the respect of other men, you have to ascend their meritocracy. In a warrior hierarchy, it's very different from a mercantile hierarchy. It's also different from a priestly hierarchy.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So would, let's say in a dictatorship, a military dictatorship, it seems to me like the goal and meaning and purpose of it is essentially imperialism, or is it what I'm looking for is, could there be a balance? Could there be a society that has a balance between these three classes?
We do have all three classes in an arrangement. So the three classes pretty much always exist. When you start to talk about class extinction, usually that's more class sublimation. The classes, because of their functions and their roles, can't really be eliminated. There are attempts at that, but usually what happens, for instance, with the warrior class, we say, oh, well, we hate warriors. Those are the jocks. Those are the chuds. Those are, we'll come up with an ideological framework that I believe this is where essentially anti-racism, anti-sexism, those all come as basically anti-warrior virtues.
Yeah.
And not to suppress any particular sex or race, because I think everyone is negatively impacted by that ideology. But I think ultimately it's just like we're attacking the warrior class. Now, what happens to the warrior class is they're brought down by regulations and bureaucracy and all these things that try to neuter them. But what happens is we get military technologies that come out that the warrior function is being outsourced. As Marshall McLuhan looked at it, it's sort of being outsourced to technology, that wars are not fought by, heroes with, swords and shields, but now it's this mechanization of warfare to the point now we're talking about artificial intelligence.
Right, drones and all that.
And so much of our technology and technological progress has come from the military. It's still true today. And so ultimately, that necessity of the what I call the war drive, following kind of Freud's concept of the death drive and the sex drive, the war drive, which drives the warrior, that's his raison d'etre, that's his purpose in life. He is there for glory and for victory, and that war drive still exists, even if it's been kind of suppressed among humanity. As a result, you almost have to have an artificial intelligence come in, because that function has to be present somewhere. And if you try to oppress it over here, it's just going to pop up in like a new species or robots or something. That's been explored in science fiction, but I think ultimately we're seeing it manifest in the world.
What about, we talked about the priestly class and the arts and these things. Where, to what extent is that something healthy or unhealthy for a society?
So, one of the problems I run into people when I talk about the priest class is, for instance, Christians will say, oh, a priest is like a Catholic priest. And so if I start talking about how like a DMV worker is a priest, or how a scientist is a priest, or how a college professor is a priest, people get mad at me because they say, no, that's not the priest. The priest is the good guy.
Right.
And those people are the bad guys. And the way I'm using that term priest class is coming from Nietzsche. And it is saying that there's a psychological type that interacts with the world with a certain set of incentives and goals and drives. And so the goal is towards things like truth. And the concept of truth, the warrior is not so much concerned with the why. Why does life exist? Why are we here? Why did God create us? The warrior is concerned with the how. How do we win? How do we achieve victory? How do we get glory? These are different questions. And so Nietzsche lays out all the problems with the priest class in general, the alienation that produces, which I think the priest class basically, it comes from language. You can't really have a priest class without language. That is their weapon.
Wow.
And so humanity, what makes us distinct from other animals is the way we interact with language. Now, some people would say, well, we're the only species with language. I don't think that's true. I think other animals
Oh, for sure.
have
Yeah.
forms of symbology.
Oh, yeah.
It gets into a semantic argument, but I would say we are distinguished as a species by our linguistic capabilities.
For sure.
And all the technology we have relates back to language. And so language is kind of like the seed technology that generates all these other technologies. And all these technologies are a potential. There's a scientist, John von Neumann, who came up with the concept of cellular automata, math. And that's basically, it's just a grid with cells, and they turn off and on. It's like a 3D Cartesian plane. And so there were some other guys who started fooling around with cellular automata. They figured we can build a computer from this. And John Conway, another British mathematician, came up with a game called the Game of Life. And he shows that with basically like 4 simple rules, it's beautiful to look up, you can create computers. So once you have a little seed of an idea, like the human linguistic structure from which we get all languages or whatever, all of the technologies we have relate back to that. And so that to me says that not necessarily in an inevitability, but at least to say that all the problems we have today were latent or potential when humans developed linguistic structures that are on par with what we have today. And that's one of the things that people think, that cavemen had stupid forms of language, but we know from linguistic studies that the more archaic a language is, the more complex the grammar, the more complex the syntax. The fact that you look at, languages like Anglo-Saxon degenerated because you had the Angles and the Saxons and the Normans and the French and the Welsh, and all these people spoke different languages. They said we need a Creole. So they break down the structure, make it simple, so that everyone can understand. People say English is so complicated, so many rules. Well, compare it to Russian. Russian doesn't just have the singular and the plural, but it has a case for 3. So you don't just say 1 egg, 2 eggs, 3 eggs. You say 1 egg, 2 eggs, 3 eggs, and then so on and so forth. That's a lot more complicated. That's one example. But the reason why Russian has that is because it's more archaic. It's had less of that cross-cultural interference that English has. So if language was really, really complicated for very primitive people, then they had the potential to create all the technology that we have today. They just didn't have the time and the kind of evolutionary pressures. What I would say is coming a lot from the war drive and the fact that the better technology you have, the more easy it is to conquer other tribes.
I have a question then. So, I mean, I'm trying to understand. When I think of priestly class, I think of a class that is the go-between between man and the divine. And I certainly understand how language plays a role in that. But are there class? I want to know, like, what is the? It seems to me that all classes can be corrupt, right? That we're humans, right? So, what are the 2 sides here? One side is a successful priestly class will function for the health, the spiritual health of a society, let's say. And then the opposite of that would be what?
Well, you're actually analyzing the priest from the perspective of the priest when you do that. You're assuming that the goals of the priest are legitimate. And I think that perspective is legitimate, but we also have to, I think, bring in the perspectives of the other classes. So from a priestly perspective, the priest is seeking truth and God and the unity of humanity and harmony, natural law, all these things. But from the perspective of the other classes, for instance, the merchant class is going to look at the priest and say, the priest sets the social rules. The priest sets the mores and the morality. And this is very important. If you're trying to sell your wares, the priest class is a danger. They're an obstacle to the free flow of goods in capitalism. So you have to figure out, okay, how do we manipulate the priest class in order to give us what we want? And we basically end up with, anti-racism, anti-sexism, what people call cultural Marxism. I think that's a very problematic term because you actually look at the development of Marxism from the beginning with Karl Marx was not really looking for capitalism, and Theodor Adorno and the actual cultural Marxists, so to speak, or Frankfurt School, were not, they were for classical music. The character that we have of cultural Marxism, I think makes it a complicated term. But I would say in general, like when Jeff Bezos does a study at Amazon and he finds that diversity lowers unionization, he says, all right, diversity is good for me as a capitalist. Is it good for society as a whole? That's a different question. That's his incentive. And so the merchant class is trying to force the priest class to act in a certain way. The warrior class has its own conception of, okay, the purpose of life is glory and victory. And so what's a warrior dominated priest class look like? Well, now the priest class is much oriented toward supporting the warrior function, sacralizing kingship, glorifying war. And so the artwork and the ritual and the mythology becomes centered around strong, heroic warriors. Those become the gods, and that's really what we get with the Indo-European mythologies, especially when we contrast the southern Neolithic, which are the farmers, with the northern Paleolithic, where the hunter-gatherers, where the warrior culture is even more strong. We're now talking about the Germanic substrate, which is actually separate from the Indo-European if you compare linguistic structures. So now you've got like a hyper-concentration of the warrior class in Northern Europe, and this is where we get Valhalla, right? At least with the Greeks, when a hero dies, he goes to the Elysian fields, he relaxes. But for the Norse, they say, when you die, you're just going to fight even more and harder than before. And it's going to be even more brutal.
Even more glory,
though. Valkyries
even
are going to come.
Yeah.
They're going to be these gigantic, strong women. So you can see how from the pure priest class, how from their perspective, the influence of the merchants and the warriors are corruptions of their task. But from the perspective of the merchants and warriors, they're like, no, you're the priest, you're supposed to support us.
So in all of this, where do the artists fit?
So art simply means skill, right? At the end of the day, we always say visual artists. That's what we think of. We think of painters and people who draw.
Right.
So that's the art is a skill and it's a technique. Now, what is that technique used towards? Is it used toward, like pornography is a form of art, but what is the purpose of that? Right? It is a very mercantile form of art. It's meant to stimulate the base animal senses, in the same way that, social media or a Hollywood movie, right, is pornographic. But you could also use art in a very priestly function. You're trying to quiet the mind and seek truth and be meditative. Or you could have art be a very warrior function. You could say, we're going to, like the Greeks, we're going to idolize the human body and the proportions and men of action. And so there's different ways that you can use art. And these three classes, again, they're not absolutes in the sense of I'm 100% warrior, 100% priest, I'm 100% merchant.
Yeah.
You can have an artist who has a mixture of those, and you're going to probably get a dominant type within that person. And art as a whole, well, then that becomes a question of what's the dominant culture, what's the dominant class configuration, that's you're going to have to interact with that as an artist. So like contemporary art, like what's the newest fashion or genre of art? They call this flat art that comes out of Silicon Valley, where the people they're like cartoon characters, and like everybody's features and characteristics became ambiguous. And every age has its own kind of dominant style of art, or an art that has reached its time or its zenith or its peak in a particular period. And that's going to reflect a certain class configuration. And, you compare the medieval Bayeux tapestry with the Renaissance. Now we've got realistic art. What does that mean?
So is art propaganda for the classes, these three classes?
Well, art is communicative. It's symbolic. There's a religious aspect of art. The process, the legend of Pygmalion, right? That you worship a piece of art so much it becomes alive to you. So the origins of art, the cave paintings in Europe, or the Hottentot figures, these are worshipful pieces. These are, you're glorifying something. This is an outpouring of love and affection and emotion. And whenever we attach emotion to an object, we sacralize it for good or for bad. I mean, we can have a voodoo doll of someone we hate and we're ripping them up and stabbing them with needles, or we can have, a statue that we adore and we pour wine on it, we offer sacrifices to
Mm-hmm,
it.
mm-hmm.
So psychologically, whenever we spend time and effort on something, uh, we're creating a sigil, we're creating an
Yes.
object of worship.
Mm.
And so inherently, within the process of creating the image, there is a symbolism. It is not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's identical to the linguistic function of the priest, but they're very much related. And as we go back in more primitive social structures, following Gebser's model of the magical to mythical to mental consciousness structures, we're going to see class merging and convergence rather than specialization in the chronology. So the shamans, right? It's like, is a shaman, is he a priest? Is he a warrior?
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't seem like a bureaucrat. He's not all dressed up in robes. He's not part of an order of priests. Like, he's just kind of this oddball omega male who maybe kind of lives in the woods or the mountain or something.
Mm-hmm.
And you go to him when you have a problem, and he like looks inside your body and gives you a bunch of drugs, and you have a weird experience, right? Is that a priest? Well, in some senses it is an origin, this kind of symbolic ecstasy, outpouring of emotion. The origins of psychology, they're all there, but they're still merged with the body. And the body is the domain of the warrior.
Mm.
And so as we move from the domain of the body, we move into the domain of mythology and symbolism.
Okay.
And now we're moving into writing systems. We're moving away from oral culture, we're moving into written culture. So from the Trojan War to now Hesiod. Now things get broken down. This is the origin of atheism, right? You can't have atheism without first having religion. Some people, when Marx or someone says, "Oh, we're originally all atheists," no, you have to have theism before you can reject it, right?
Atheism, right?
So you have that period where we really get a priest class is coming out of the written word and literature.
So, question for you then. Where I'm going with this and what I'm hearing you say, on the one question is, can there be art for art's sake? And secondly, could there be a fourth class, the shaman class, who are the artists?
So, yeah, that's an interesting thing. And I think you probably, if you had to attack the tripartite class structure and say, couldn't there be a fourth class? I think artists would be the best case to be made for that.
Mm-hmm.
The problem I have with that is I think I think the tripartite class system is not only the simplest model that you can make that still has explanatory power, but additionally it is the traditional model. It's not me looking back and projecting my model into history and saying, well, I think this is a model that makes sense for history. No, this is the model that the ancients came up with to describe their own society.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at the Greeks or the Norse or the Hindus or anyone, they're going to come up with this tripartite model.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's specific to the Indo-Europeans, or if you want to try to look at the Mayans and the Chinese and say, no, it was everybody, that's kind of hard to distinguish, because these ideas, once they get out there, people think that in the past everyone was these isolated tribes. People were migrating everywhere, especially the Indo-Europeans. They're going from Ireland to Bangladesh.
Yeah.
And they had horses, right? They didn't have planes, trains, or automobiles. So people migrated extremely long distances, and ideas spread even faster. And so it's really hard to distinguish, is this something that's universal to the mind of man because of maybe the way that the frontal lobe interacts with the middle of the brain, interacts with the brain stem? Or is it just an idea? It's almost like the question of mathematical realism. Is math something real that we discover, or is it just a model that we create provisionally that just so happens to correspond with the reality?
So, looking at the problems of Western civilization, America specifically, what should the artist's role be?
Well, it depends on what your goal is. So if your goal is to make money, your art is going to look a lot different than if your goal is to strive for the truth, which might even look different from if your goal is to gain a sense of familiarity in a world that's increasingly alienating you from any sort of familiarity, or where familiarity is very cheap and commodified and transient and fashionable. I think it really depends on what your goal is and what you want. And and even to figure out that process of who are you and what you want. Are you a blank slate where you could be anything? Or are there certain inalienable parts of you that relate to your personal history, to your broader history of where you come from? Do you know where you come from? Do you know who your ancestors are? Do you know what their story was? And I believe, through my own experiences and observations, that we do repeat patterns of the past. We didn't pop out of the ether. I believe that language is a great example of this. If you don't believe in evolution, then I don't know what you think about linguistics, because they pretty much mimetics follows the same track of genetics of you have mutations, you have adaptations, you have change over time, and you have certain evolutionary pressures that are going to push a language in one direction or another. And following Chomsky, I think the way that we speak is not just arbitrary, but it impacts our psychology and even our spirituality. So we have to ask, what is our language? That's a very broad question. So, well, we all speak English, so I guess we should all be the same because we speak the same language. But there are idiosyncrasies within English that when you talk to a person, when you hear a person's voice, you can start to get a sense of a person's personality. I think when you look at a person's face, you can start to get a sense of their personality. And so I think there are certain parts of being incarnated in a body, in a linguistic history, in a personal history, that these basically serve as your lodestones for figuring out, okay, this is where I come from, so this is going to help me understand, as an artist, where I'm going.
If you were cultural czar of America, what would you have artists do?
Wow. I mean, that's such a hypothetical. I almost hate that question. Not the person asking, but I hate the question because it implies, and it's almost like, what if you could create your own language? It's like that inherently is a paradoxical question, right? So for me to be Czar of America, it wouldn't be me. It would mean that Bill Gates loves me now, and that I control the IMF, and there's an entire, because all these things are connected. The idea of, and again, from the warrior class perspective, you say, well, everything's a military dictatorship, so just put the right guy in charge and everything will change. But we don't have that system. We have a mercantile system which is ruled judicially by councils. When you ask who controls the world, it's councils, right? So what is when you have CEOs, right? But they're the front men, right? They're like the mermaid at the front of the ship. The people who actually control it are these stakeholders and stockholders, and they get together at round tables to make decisions. For most people, that's confusing, because we always want to say, wait, there's got to be a king in charge. There's got to be someone responsible. The czar, the president. It doesn't actually work that way. But if we, and I'll humor the hypothetical and not be so pedantic, right? So if I was in charge, what would I want artists to do? Well, my personal goals and my personal incentives and what I want to see in the world is I want to see a world that's more beautiful. And to me, that's a huge part of physical aesthetics, the environment. And so, I'm going to try to, it's not so much of what I would promote, because I think artists are really good at figuring out how to create beauty. It would be mostly about what I would cut off, because I think most of art today is a product of billionaires pumping billions of dollars into destruction and resentment and hate and ugliness, the promotion of ugliness, in order to demoralize people for the purpose really of depopulation, because they don't need us. They used to need us to work on the farms, now they have robots to do that. That's the short story of why everything sucks. So I would say, so I would say, look, if we're trying to depopulate the planet, rather than lying and tricking people into killing themselves and being so depressed they don't want to have kids, let's just be honest about it. And maybe some people will freak out, but I'm the czar. So if you freak out, that's your problem. So, okay, we don't need 7 billion people on the planet, and that's actually really destructive to the Earth's beauty. But we're going to go about it in a conscientious way, and we're going to have to figure out how to do that. I'm not saying there's a good solution. I'm saying we're in a really bad situation. And no matter how you get out of it, it's going to be ugly. The merchants are trying their way, and that has its own problems. but the priests and the warriors are they're gonna have their own way, and it's gonna be a different kind of destruction. But there's gonna have to be some destruction that happens, and I don't endorse that. I didn't get us into this situation, but you know, if you're in charge, you have to deal with it. And so I would just say we have to stop going about it in this mercantile way where we consensually trick people into hating themselves so they stop having kids. We need to say, okay, we're gonna stop having kids, but we need to do that in a way that is honest. That's one of the differences between the merchant and the other classes. Is the merchant's always trying to trick you into a sale, whereas the warrior's just like, nope, you're my slave, I control everything. And the priest is like, it's all up to God, and you got to follow God's law, and if you don't like it, you're going to hell. You know, so there's different approaches to this. None of them are painless. There's no such thing as a painless solution.
Right.
But that's the first thing I would do. I would say all the money that's going toward the promotion of hatred and ugliness, and that just tries to make people feel miserable intentionally. We're just going to stop funding it, not even banning it. Copyright law is a great example. Why do we have a law that says that Disney owns something and that if you do anything similar, you get thrown in jail? I just say eliminate, basically, for every big corporation, after you earn $1 million on it, no more copyright protections. That would open up artists could say, oh, I like Star Wars, I'm going to remake Star Wars. I don't have to worry about what Disney's going to say. I'm going to remake Lord of the Rings. Tolkien is dead. His son, I believe, is now dead. You know, there's no copyright, you know, there's no concept of copyright anymore for those people. Maybe for small artists, but for big corporations, you eliminate that and you let people take any kind of media they want, mix it up and mash it up and make their own creative stuff. I think there's already enough art in the universe. I think we've already made enough for 1,000 lifetimes more. Like, we have so much stuff out there. We more need to dig into what we have and appreciate what we have and say, what's the next new thing? What's you know, there's something new and brilliant. Sometimes just go back to basics, and like it's like this with literature too. There's so many great stories out there. Why do you need to make a new story? Why not just there's so many Greek epic poems that you could make into a Hollywood movie.
Sure.
And I think the medium of film and even video games is really the medium that we need to work with, but we need to work with it from really good stuff that goes back to Babylon and Marduk fighting Tiamat. Like, why can't that be a Hollywood movie?
So, on the topic of globalization, which demographic is most targeted for depopulation?
So, when we talk about demographics and we talk about race, we have to look at it in the context of a class structure that is attempting to monopolize power. And when we look at political revolutions throughout history, when we look at the different civilizations, what we find is that some of the most egalitarian societies have been in the West. You look at China, and there's this term, Asiatic despotism. That didn't come about accidentally. It's because traditionally China, as the main power of Asia, has had a central authority, and everyone else. That's what the Fu Manchu hairstyle or the
the Q, I think
the
they call
Q,
it.
right? The Q. Why was everyone forced to wear that? It was a technique of social control to say you're a slave.
Exactly.
So everybody is a slave.
You could never cut it off.
That's radical, right? That's radical. In the West, there's always been a very large middle class, and so the Western style of governance is antithetical to the merchant class. They don't like the idea of a big, healthy middle class because there's always the potential for the sharing of power. They don't want to share power. They want to concentrate it. They're not interested in making the world a better place. They're interested in making the worst world so that they have all the power. They care about relative power, not absolute power. So they're happy to make everyone miserable. And so when they look at the West and Western traditions, they're afraid of that. And then they look at all these other people. They look at the Chinese, they look at South America, they look at Africa, and they see models of culture and governance that are much more amenable. Like, we think of Timbuktu. If you talk to an African nationalist, they'll say, Africa has a great history because look at Timbuktu, and the richest men in the history lived in Africa. Well, that was because of the slave trade. That was because black people were enslaving each other and selling slaves to each other,
Yeah.
making tons of money. That's a very inegalitarian model. So this is hard sometimes for people, libertarians, to understand, but egalitarianism is the most threatening thing to the powers that be. Again, linguistically, that's difficult to wrap your head around because you think, wait, I thought the central dogma of our civilization was egalitarianism and that's what the elites were using. It's paradoxical, it's contradictory, but when you understand that the merchant class has this concept of, I'm going to sell you this is a product, this is good for you, it's consensual, you understand that they can only rule through lying, that they're going to use egalitarianist language in an Orwellian sense to actually defeat a real, true, healthy middle class. So what they see is traditional America is 90% white. We want to undermine America. How do we do that? We'll attack their religion. We'll say Christianity is stupid. We'll attack the majority racial demographic. We'll bring in other groups. Like I said with Jeff Bezos, okay, diversity is going to lower unionization. It's going to make me more profits. So we'll make the country more diverse. They're not interested in helping the third world. They're not interested in making anyone's lives better except their own. And even then, they would be happy to make themselves more miserable if everyone else was made 10 times more miserable. That's the way they think. So it's a king of the hill situation. And as a result, yeah, they attack Christianity. Not because necessarily they hate Christianity in particular, although some of them do. And they attack whiteness. Not because they're necessarily black Africans, right? Not necessarily because they're Asians. But look at Bill Gates, or look at the Koch brothers, or look at all these people who have either sat by or funded the academic structure that has led to what we call these whiteness studies and so on. They're not doing it. When Lady Gaga goes out and talks about white supremacy, it's like, all right, Lady Gaga, you be the first.
Well, she's Jewish, though. I believe she's Jewish.
I think she's Italian.
Is she?
You could, yeah.
I guess we'll have to look it up.
That's my belief. But anyway, you can pick out, okay, Neil Patrick Harris or someone who is, we could create a whole list of all the white people who are talking about white supremacy. And the question is, you're white. Why don't you step down from your position of power and give someone else a chance? It's because it's not about attacking whiteness in a consistent way. It's about using an ideological framework to attack the middle class. And so you've got tons of rich white people who are happy to blab on all day about white supremacy. And meanwhile, they're not giving away their wealth. They're not giving away their power. They're concentrating it. And they're creating these contradictory, convoluted, academic, pedantic systems of, oh, well, if you say we're all equal, that's colorblind racism. And like there's always another level where they want to trip you up. So it's not so much about actually removing white people from power, because you still have plenty of blonde-haired, blue-eyed Anglo-Saxons who have power. They're very happy to go along with this anti-white supremacy ideology because it helps them from a class perspective. They want a system of people who are angry and confused and resentful. And I know it's a meme, and I know people don't like to hear this. It's very blue-pilled, but they really want you hating black people. If you're a white person, they want you hating black people. Why? Because black people have no power in this country. They want to put up Obama. So you say, oh, that's black supremacy. They want to talk about BLM. Meanwhile, who has the money, who has the power, and where are people actually dying? 533 white people get killed by blacks on average every year. This is 2019 statistics.
I think it's much higher than that. I recently looked that up.
Well, if you can provide me the studies.
I can, like around 200,000 a year.
Wow, in America.
It's, I'll have to find you the stats.
I'm going to have to strongly disagree with that.
Oh, I can show you the stats, but I didn't make the stats, but I'll show them to you.
I'm just looking at the FBI crime statistics where people talk about 13 to 50. That's what I'm talking about. And that's my belief. And even if it is 200,000, it's still not the biggest killer of white people in the country. It's heart disease and obesity resulted diseases. And that comes from a poisonous diet that black people didn't construct. So I think anyway, if you want to blow it up to 200,000, which I think is a 10,000% exaggeration, that's my opinion, I'm still going to say you're still nowhere near the actual biggest killer of white people.
They're different
So
topics, though. Race relations and diet. They're different topics, though.
I would not take that position. So I'm an anti-racist. I'm a
Hmm.
Jewish anti-racist, and I believe, unironically, that when you're told to hate black people because violent black on white crime is the biggest problem in this country, I think that is a distraction from the billionaire class, and I think that there is well documented reason to understand that the whole concept of race, it doesn't make sense on a personal level. It is a construct of, scientific racialists.
Hmm.
I think that if you want to say, oh, well, there's average differences between people, I think everyone can agree with that. They disagree about the origins. Is it genetic? Is it environmental? Is it because of white supremacy? But everyone acknowledges average differences. And if you don't want to live in a neighborhood or you're afraid to walk through an area of town at night, that's your personal decision. And I'm not here to track people down and browbeat them for what they do, because the most liberal people I know, they make their personal choices in their life that could be described by other people as racist. I'm not here to go around and criticize everyone's personal decisions. I'm here to say that when you codify and dogmatize racialism as the end-all be-all axiomatic religion that guides your life principle, I'm on the complete opposite side of that spectrum. I believe that people need identity and religion and a concept of themselves. I think that essentially racism and anti-racism is a kind of Caducean trap in a prison that puts people in a situation where everything is this abstract. The liberals are always searching for the hidden Nazi under their bed, and the secret, oh, Putin is Hitler, and we're gonna find these people, I just did an interview with a guy in Kansas who says that racists are the main problem in America and they need to be put in prisons and medicated until they stop being racist. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that racism is the biggest problem in America. And I don't think black people are the biggest problem. When people talk about, what about BLM? Black people didn't invent BLM. Black people didn't invent the NAACP.
Who did?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Now I know the answer.
Yes, that's why.
I know that's going to be the answer.
Yeah.
And now I have to contextualize that answer as a man of Jewish ancestry myself. I have to Jew-splain it to you, and I have to tell you.
Just as long as you're not mansplaining it.
No, I'm not mansplaining.
I'm kidding. Go ahead.
No, but the point of the matter is, Jews don't have a warrior class. They didn't conquer America or any of these people by force. When you actually look at the history of relationships, I'll give you an example of Bismarck, someone that Hitler was a big fan of, some that right-winger people in general are like, oh yeah, Otto von Bismarck, right-wing guy. When you look at the emancipation of Jews by Napoleon in Germany, the resulting backlash and anti-Semitism, what Otto von Bismarck did is he codified the relationship between the German monarchy and the Jewish population. Now you have to ask, why did he do that? And I view it through the perspective of von Bismarck, looking at the Jews as a people who are specialized as a priest class and a merchant class. Mm-hmm. And he's asking, how do I fund the German Empire and build this railroad system? How do I deal with Marxism? How do I deal with socialism? So he's talking to Ferdinand Lassalle, who's a Jewish socialist, and you'd think, no, he'd be totally opposed to that. But no, he's talking to those people, and he's integrating welfare reforms, and he's talking with, Jewish financiers, and he's trying to get railroads built. He has certain objectives in his mind. This is what the European aristocracy has been doing for over 1,000 years. They've had a Jewish financier class that's been there. The term for it at the time is court Jew, and they've been dealing with those people, and they've been specializing in their culture of art and warfare, and they've been saying, okay, well, we'll have a class of people over here. During the Crusades, the Pope says we need to fight the infidel, the non-Christians. What he meant was the Muslims, but what the average person heard was, I know a guy next door who's like that, he's a Jew. And so they start attacking Jews, and then the bishops and the king say, no, we didn't mean the Jews. So that to me says that the survival and the existence of the Jewish people in Europe is wholly owed to the priest class and the warrior class, who saw them as, this is the ethnic group that we are going to not export, but we are going to
Protect?
not, well, yeah, we're going to protect them, but in the same way that we ship our jobs overseas today, right, to India or wherever, we're going to ship the function of the merchant class over to the Jews. So they're going to take care of that work for us. And why did they do that? Well, an interesting question. But that was the choice that they made. And so the Jewish people wouldn't be able to survive. They didn't have any ability to protect themselves. All of their physical protection against pogroms and mobs of peasants, it all came from the bishops and the kings. So if you ask, why are these Jews around? Why are they creating the NAACP? Why are they doing this and that? It's because you have a European aristocracy that has enabled that has decided to that's a good idea. So ultimately, who's responsible for that, right? You could say, okay, well, if somebody does something bad, and I clearly don't put all Jews in one category, but if somebody does something bad, to what extent is it like if a criminal, let's say there's a murderer and he's in prison, and then the judge says, let him out of prison, let him go on the streets, and he murders more people. Whose fault is that? Well, we say, in our concept of ethics, we say, well, the murderer has to bear some responsibility for killing people. But also the judge is kind of responsible as well.
Sure.
When you ask at the end of the day, like who's in control, who controls the world, who's in power, I think you do have to say, okay, well, yeah, we have a merchant class and we have Jews who have left Orthodox Judaism and they've become Reformed, they've become secular, they've become Marxists, they become Boasians, they become Freudians. Kevin MacDonald has gone through the Jewish intellectual history. But at the end of the day, I have to look at the bigger structure here. I can't say that Jews have overpowered everybody else in the world and that they're just doing whatever they want with no consequences. I have to say that power and the way that class structures work is there's always cooperation. There's always that form of consent. That it's like a business. There's cooperation. It's not simply, I think sometimes Kevin MacDonald and other people paint this, oh, those poor European aristocrats, they were just taken over by the Jews and they didn't see what was coming and they were so naive. It's like, no, they looked at the Jews and they had a particular stereotypical opinion of them. And they very cynically said, we're going to use these people to accomplish our goals in coherence with Freemasonry, which it was a real group. Okay, it's not a conspiracy. There's a real group of people. They were moving away from Christianity. Why? Because of things like alchemy and astronomy with Tycho Brahe and not Friedrich, not Heinrich. Was it Heinrich the Second? If you go to Prague, there's a section called Alchemist Alley because it was Rudolf the Second. I'm sorry, I'm mixing up all my German monarchs today, but Rudolf the Second was instrumental. He wanted to create a pan-European empire, as so many other great men of history did. He wanted to create this pan-European empire, and so for him, he was essentially a Freemason before it was cool because he was interested in alchemy and paganism and Kabbalah, and he was like, I don't really care about your dogma. I just want to create philosopher's stones and have a world empire, right? So when we talk about globalism really comes from the Romans and their descendants and these European aristocrats who want to create world empires and rule over all these people. And they're not really dogmatic Christians, although they've incorporated stuff. You look at certain esoteric genealogies, they believe they're descended from Jesus Christ, and even though that's not really Orthodox canonical Christianity, right? So they'll mix and match different things together. They're not necessarily anti-Christian, but they're certainly not Orthodox Christian. They haven't been that way for a long time. When you look at Rudolf, and he has these completely heterodox views, and that's what he and his cohort believed in. So the quote-unquote European elite has not been Christian for a very long time, and we've just been exoterically catching up to that to the point where now the iceberg is fully submerged. We're like, whoa, wait a second, we were a Christian country 50 years ago. Now everything's like atheist, and then you've got Satanist shoes, and it's a crazy world we live in, but that process happened over a very long time. So these quick things is like, oh, Jews have been emancipated. Oh, now we've got, Jews are creating the NAACP. I'm simplifying. I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. But what I'm trying to say is that all of these changes and revolutions, like the Bolshevik Revolution didn't happen in a day, it didn't happen in a year, it didn't happen in a decade. It happened over centuries, right? And you can trace it back to Christianity, you can trace it back to Judaism. I say let's keep going. Let's go to Zoroastrianism. Let's go to the origins of monotheism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the other problems I have with the Jewish monocausality, that everything's about the Jews. That's a form of worship. That's really saying the Jews are God's chosen people, but just replacing God with Satan. And I don't believe that. I don't think they're either of those things. I think they're human beings just like everybody else. And I think they have certain special class specializations that do make them unique. They really don't have a warrior class. You know, the IDF is very insignificant compared to the army of lawyers and doctors and professors that are around the world in the diaspora.
So what do you think would be the best relationship between Jews and literally whites, like European Christians and this
Okay.
what would be the most healthy relationship between
Well,
these
it
two?
depends on your perspective. If you're Jewish,
What's your perspective?
what's my perspective?
Yeah.
Well, my perspective is that I think that the Indo-Europeans started a revolution. They spread out from the steppe with their horses and chariots, introducing military and social and religious technologies that the world had never before seen, and they obliterated the competition. Okay, so there are some people in this world who say, like, well, there's, on the one hand there's truth, and on the other hand there's what's good, and sometimes those two contradict. Like, sometimes it's good to be a peaceful person, but sometimes it's true that, like, you know, the warrior wins, right? And I think that from my worldview, there is something, the truth and goodness converge at some point. They do diverge throughout history, but kind of in the long arc, they kind of converge. This is my, ethical, moral framework, is that, these things ultimately, in the process of seeking God, we're ultimately going to do what's good for us to survive and thrive. And so the Indo-Europeans, for some reason, they had a really good way of figuring out how to survive and thrive that just completely wiped everybody out. Now, they didn't kill everybody. They didn't genocide people necessarily. They took over a society in a minoritarian fashion. Not everyone was Indo-European. They set up caste systems and class systems that we even see in Europe in the Norse mythology of the Thrall and the Carl and the Jarl, that they had stratifications. They had a kind of aristocratic egalitarianism among themselves. Kevin McDonald has done research in that, but there's a whole field of Indo-European studies. So to me, they created something revolutionary. That's where Judaism comes from, okay? And that's what people don't want to talk about. Jews don't want to admit that because they want to say, oh, we're the first people ever, nothing came before us. That's wrong. Also, the anti-Semites don't want to say that because, no, Jews are dirty and they're evil and they're the opposite of the Indo-European. No, Judaism comes from Zoroastrianism, which is an Indo-European revolution in its own, where they started saying the gods are evil and there's one God who's good. That was another revolution. So
monotheism.
Right. Well, they had a dualistic system, so we say technically it's not monotheism, but that's the origin of it. It also is happening in Egypt. Egypt was another multicultural society where you had Indo-Europeans, you had Nubians, you had Semites, you had Copts, right? You had all kinds of people in there, all giving their own influence and occupying a different level of the social strata.
Mm-hmm.
Is that good? Is that bad? What is that? I say ultimately the Indo-Europeans had something really, really good. And that was the foundation of Judaism. Now, over time, Judaism changed. Just like any religion evolves, it changed over time.
Mm-hmm.
You eventually get, Kabbalah, you get the Talmud, you get the Torah, you get different parts of it. You get the distinction between the Kohanim and the rest of Judaism, and you can do all kind of research into that. So what I'm trying to say here is that the relationship of Jews to Indo-Europeans or Indo-European culture or different populations, I think has to take account of the history here of what came from what. You got Yoram Hazony out there who wants to tell you that Jews invented nationalism, and if you're a nationalist, and I'm not a nationalist, by the way, so it doesn't work on me, but if you're a nationalist, you should love the Jews. That's their conception of this self. That's part of their evolutionary strategy, is that they believe they're the chosen people, they invented everything, they're the best people ever. I don't buy into that. I appreciate and I respect everything that they've been able to do in terms of their survival strategy, but I have to say that they came from somewhere and they owe an ancestry to something, and they have eliminated their warrior class, and so in a sense they've circumcised themselves, right? They've cut up that part of their body, the warrior part, but all of their mythology and all of their theology, a lot of it came from Platonism, okay? And that's, anti-Semites will attack Platonism, because, oh, it's similar to Judaism. Yes, it is, because that's where the Jews got their theology, right? They got it from all of these Indo-Europeans, right? So when you start saying that, it's evil because the Jews do it, oh, the Jews did this, that, I think it becomes too simplistic. We have to really dig. If we want to know what a thing is, we have to know where it comes from. And when we just say Judaism is this absolute thing, that's what Jews believe. And I don't buy into that. I don't buy into it as they're the absolute personification of good in the world, and I don't buy into the idea that they're absolute personification of evil. I think because of their class structure of cutting off the warrior class, they've become very good at being priests and merchants. And in a world where technology is replacing the warrior function, that's a very successful strategy. So they end up being at the head of, these cultural revolutions like anti-racism, which produces the NAACP, or they end up being at the front of, other kinds of religious revolutions in terms of, oh, you want to look at the porn industry. Well, there's a lot of explanations for that. I know we were talking earlier about the personality of Luke Ford and how he brought me up recently. I didn't know about it. I was just showing a video. He's name dropped me, so I'll name drop him back. As much as he and I don't get along, he still has done, his work on Jews in the porn industry and why that coalesces. But yeah, I mean, so what's the proper role? Again, it's a paradoxical question because it assumes that I have the power to organize the globe in the way I want, which is just totally a false image of reality. What we should be thinking about is what can we do? And so what should our relationship be to Jews?
Who's we now? Because
Right.
you said you were
Okay.
a Jew, and now you're saying,
Right. Yeah. What can we do? That's going to be different answers for different people. So from a Jewish perspective, what can we do is how can we promote Jewish interests? And that might mean we're going to promote diversity because that's going to protect us from pogroms. Because if there's a bunch of other ethnicities and they're all hating each other, then we're safe.
Right.
So that's one way to view it. Now, if you're not Jewish and you're trying to, and I'm using that tongue-in-cheek, ethnically Jewish, I don't follow the idea that the Jews are the chosen people of God. But if you're coming at things from a white positive perspective, which is not my perspective, you're trying to do the best thing for the white race, then you're going to have your own answer. My answer is, again, going back to, we're trying to make the world a beautiful place. This mercantile system, it's done a lot of things. You could question, are those things good or bad? It certainly brought us to the point where we are. The question is, where do we want to go going forward? If we have a society where, warrior values are suppressed and the merchant and the priest are held up and the merchant at the top, you're going to have a system where Jews predominate because that's what they specialize in.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just change that incentive structure, if you say, okay, well, you know what, we're not going to buy into capitalism anymore. Sorry, the fact that you have copyright law, we don't care about your copyright. We're not going to enforce it anymore. We're not going to throw people in jail for using a Disney movie anymore. Also, your whole banking system, we don't care anymore. We don't care that you had a fiat currency. Well, we'll change it. We're not going to have it based on usury anymore. These are things, it's not simply that the world is this way and it has to be this way. It's that it's actively at every level being enforced to be this way. And you don't actually have to add in a whole bunch of complicated bandages and fixes and we have to go back to the 1500s. No, you simply have to eliminate the daily attacks that maintain the system as it is, and the incentive structure will change. Just like if you have an environment where you're pouring toxic sewage every day into an estuary,